Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 14th of April. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 415 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The UK Ministry of Defence has claimed in its daily intelligence briefing that Ukrainian troops have been forced to make orderly withdrawals from positions that previously held in the highly contested town of Bakhmut, and that the last 2 days have seen an intense artillery bombardment from Russian forces. China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang said today that China would not sell weapons to parties involved in the conflict in Ukraine and would regulate the export of items with dual civilian and military use. He was speaking at a news conference with his visiting German counterpart, Annalena Baerbock, who urged China to step up to exert its influence on Russia over Ukraine. She said Germany wanted China to influence Russia to stop its aggression. A Russian Su-35 aircraft carried out airstrikes in the settlement of Orikhiv in the Zaporizhia region, Andriy Yermak, the head of the Ukrainian president's office, said earlier today. Ukraine will test and use any non-banned weapons to liberate its territory, including Russian-occupied Crimea, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defence Council has said. Ukraine's security service warned to the millions of people in the country celebrating Orthodox Easter this weekend to limit their attendance at mass events and to avoid lingering unnecessarily in temples during the traditional blessing of the Easter basket. Ukraine's Ministry of Reintegration of the Temporarily Occupied Territories said that Ukraine has retrieved the bodies of 82 of its soldiers from Russian-controlled territory today. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has said that Russia has put its Pacific naval fleet on high alert as part of a surprise inspection aimed at building its defensive capabilities. Finland's embassy in Moscow has contacted the Russian Foreign Ministry after it received a letter containing powder. Ukraine will receive 19 French-made Caesar howitzer artillery systems from Denmark within the coming weeks, the Danish Defence Ministry said in a statement earlier today. China's Defence Minister Li Shangfu will visit Russia from the 16th to the 19th of April and will meet Russian military officials. The UN nuclear chief, Rafael Grossi, has warned that we are living on borrowed time, following 2 recent landmine explosions near Ukraine's Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. President Alexander Vučić has insisted that Serbia never sold weapons or ammunition to Ukraine or Russia, responding to a leaked secret Pentagon report, which we will be discussing shortly. And Russia's Prosecutor General said it had opened an investigation into a video showing Russian soldiers apparently beheading a Ukrainian prisoner of war lying on the ground. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by Dave Doogan, who is the SNP MP for Angus. Dave stood as the SNP candidate in the Snap general election in December 2019, and he won with an 8.8% majority, defeating the Conservative incumbent, Kirstine Hare. Dave previously worked as an aircraft engineer within the Ministry of Defence before leaving to pursue his career in politics. He currently undertakes the role of the shadow SNP spokesperson on defence. He's also a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and he represents the SNP on the Defence Select Committee in the House of Commons. Dave, good evening. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be back on Reporting Scotland.
Well, we're delighted to see you, and thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland on your Friday evening. We really appreciate it. Our first story this evening is that Jack Douglas Teixeira of North Dighton, Massachusetts, a 21-year-old member of the US Air Force National Guard, accused of leaking highly classified military intelligence records online, made his initial appearance before a federal judge in Boston today as he faces charges he unlawfully removed and retained classified materials. At the hearing, Boston's top federal national security prosecutor, Nadine Pellegrini, requested that Teixeira be detained pending trial, and a detention hearing was set for Wednesday. The leaked classified documents at the heart of the investigation were posted online on a social media website in March, and perhaps earlier, but news of their existence did not come to light until it was reported by the New York Times last week. It is believed to be the most serious security breach since the WikiLeaks documents in 2010. In the WikiLeaks case, the leaker, US Army Private First Class Chelsea Manning, was sentenced to 35 years in prison. President Barack Obama later commuted her sentence. US officials are still assessing the damage done by the leaks, which included records showing purported details of Ukrainian military vulnerabilities and embarrassed Washington by revealing its spying on allies. In a criminal complaint made public on Friday, Teixeira was charged with unlawfully copying and possessing classified defense records. Each offense can carry up to 10 years in prison. He was also charged with another offense which makes it a crime for an employee of the United States to knowingly remove classified records to an unauthorized location. In a sworn statement, an FBI agent said that Teixeira had held a top-secret security clearance since 2021, and that he also maintained sensitive, compartmented access to other highly classified programs. Since May 2022, the FBI said, Teixeira has been serving as an E-3 Airman First Class in the US Air Force National Guard and had been stationed at Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts. Teixeira only spoke twice during the brief proceedings, answering yes when asked if he understood his right to remain silent, and to confirm that he had filled out a financial affidavit, which the judge said shows he will qualify to be represented by a federal public defender. It was not clear whether Teixeira had yet secured legal representation. The investigative news outlet Bellingcat, the Washington Post, and the New York Times have traced these documents' earliest appearance to a defunct server on the messaging site Discord. So, Dave, firstly, there's not a great deal we can say about this case at the moment because it's news that's still developing in Boston at the moment. However, we do know that the mission of the 102nd Air Intelligence Wing, which is the part of the National Guard that this young man was serving in, we know that their mission was to provide worldwide precision intelligence and combat and control, along with trained and experienced airmen for expeditionary combat support and homeland security. So with regard to this mission for providing worldwide precision intelligence, it's not a surprise, is it, that there's apparently access to intelligence of the types which we're now hearing are reported to have been leaked.
No, indeed. And I think one of the things that the United States intelligence agencies will be looking at is how this has happened again. It's one thing to go up against somebody who's got malign intent, who's looking to enrich themselves or gain influence within a foreign jurisdiction. That doesn't appear to be the case with this gentleman. And I think it appears certainly on the face of it to be more about developing a reputation in an online forum for having access and demonstrating that access to having to classified, very highly classified information. So, I don't think this is. I don't think we can condemn the entire apparatus of the United States intelligence service. Got a highly developed, highly skilled, globally leading in many respects intelligence service. And when it comes to organizations like the CIA, these things tend not to happen. This is more a feature of military intelligence embedded within either the Air Force, the Army, or the Navy. So, what I would refute, though, is that this is a function of this gentleman's age. I think it's more a reflection of his characteristic. I think it would be a disservice to the many hundreds, if not thousands, in the US context of other people who are a similar age who don't go plastering the classified information that they are privy to on social media message boards in a bid to attract attention and make themselves look important. And I think if we look at the plethora of security breaches within the United States and other allies in terms of intelligence breaches will find a range of ages, most of which are very much older than 21. And I think his age, there could be a maturity element to it. But I think there will be a lot of other people a similar age to him who are not doing this behaviour.
Well, that's a very good point. I can't remember the age of Chelsea Manning when she was arrested and briefly and jailed. Then, although we know that, of course, President Trump, who's in his 70s, is said to have retained highly classified documentation and removed it to an unauthorized location. So that rather supports the point that you're making, that it's definitely not something that only only young men and young women do. But we were saying that this is possibly the biggest leak for US military intelligence since WikiLeaks. And you were saying you don't think that it doesn't appear at this moment to have the same motivation. Do you think it has the potential to do as much damage? And in asking that, I'm aware that, at least in his public pronouncements from Ireland, President Biden has said that in the leaked material there is nothing contemporaneous.
Yeah, well, it's. I think that I'm not sure of the volume of information that's been leaked, much less the nature of it. I think he's. There's serious questions to be asked about. You know, it was clearly appropriate for him to have access to that information. That's consistent with the clearance that he had. But in terms of the control, and many people in their ordinary lives that don't operate in intelligence, who operate in engineering or law enforcement, will be very familiar with document control and issue control. It's not a new technology. It's not a new discipline. It's been operating for decades, and it operates in the physical and in the digital domain. So how it is that somebody who, although they have quite significant security clearance, are still quite a junior member of an organisation, can be accessing and removing at will this type of information begs questions as much about their control over documentation and issue control, because I'm quite confident that these systems, checks and balances, are in place within the CIA, for example. They'll certainly be in place within MI6. And so, the idea that you can just, take them home will be for a lot of people very, very concerning.
That's a fair point. And now you were talking that we've touched on the particular age of this young man, and we're saying that we don't think it's not a key consideration here. And as you were rightly saying, and was being confirmed by the FBI, that this young man had, as you'd expect, had all the necessary security clearances. But I was and you've touched also, as you quite rightly did, on the large number of young men and women who served the US military and the UK military and elsewhere. And I was just wondering, reflecting for a moment, you've served as well. How difficult can it be to keep young service personnel, and in this case, who are nowhere near the front line, they're back in Massachusetts, how difficult can it be to keep them focused on important aspects of their roles, such as preserving national security around about documentation?
Well, so that's quite an interesting point, actually, because my understanding that he was involved in sort of the more what's collectively termed as grey zone or cyber type activity. And of course, when it comes to issues to do with cyber, the front line can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be the immediate vicinity of a kinetic contact warfare. And of course, similarly, the United States and the United Kingdom and other allies are invested heavily in unmanned technology, which of course is controlled from the other side of the world quite often. And so the front line is an elastic, if not opaque, consideration now in terms of modern warfare. Incidentally, just to be very clear with viewers, Andrew, it's important to note that whilst I did enjoy 18 years within the Ministry of Defence, every one of those was as a civilian. I was never in uniform, which is a mistake that's often made, and so I have no particular issue clarifying it. But in
Thanks,
terms
Dave.
of and it's and the intelligence that he had access to was, my understanding, as a nature was as a consequence of his role in cyber type
Yep.
activity. So I mean, I think that's an interesting learning point as well, which is the people with those skills that are particularly adept at that type of electronic cyber combat and conflict tend to be of a younger nature, and so I think it's important that it's just as it might be thousands of miles away from the front line, the consequences of misappropriating that type of information will have very real consequences on the actual physical front line. So I think it's important to bear that in mind as well. I think your point about how to keep people engaged when they're young, um, I don't think. I don't think this was a problem of idle hands. I think this is more of an issue to do with a mindset and perhaps emotional or maybe mental health issues. But that's for the courts in the United States to figure out. Closer to home, it's harder to keep people engaged. The United Kingdom has a very difficult time recruiting to the three services. The army, in particular, is very difficult to recruit and just as difficult to retain too. Young people nowadays have a very different outlook on what it is to have a career. They will not be joining, many times, they will not be joining the army looking to do a full term of 20 plus years. They'll be looking to do X, Y, and Z within 7 years, this qualification, that skill set, and I'll be away back out to industry or where I'll get better money, better terms and conditions, and that's just the way that young people look at it now. And the army in the United Kingdom, so-called Army Scotland, which has got a physical presence in Catterick in Yorkshire and in Belfast in Northern Ireland, they have huge challenges and they can't fill their recruitment quota, and they are using large numbers of Commonwealth troops, recruits rather, to fill those gaps, which further erodes whilst there's no question mark over the quality of soldiers that are recruited from these communities and from these countries. You'll be well aware that an awful lot about serving together is about representing your nation and representing your community and being drawn from the same country and community and the realm that you're then potentially going to have to go into harm's way to defend. So you far more challenging to maintain interest within the UK Army, the British Army, is the quality of equipment, the disastrous, disgraceful standard of service person accommodation, particularly single person accommodation within the British Army, and a lack of opportunity, and wanting to join this regiment but getting told you're going to join that regiment. These are the kind of things that turn people and make them leave after a very short period of time to go and get a job elsewhere. And there's a lot of people sitting, not very much in the army, getting bored and thinking I could be out doing some other job, and it's a real shame because there's great opportunities with a life in uniform, whether that's the Army, Air Force, or Royal Navy, and it's a real shame that the Army in particular isn't able to deliver on that.
Thanks, Dave. That's some great perspective. Thank you. And you'd be able to bring us lots of insight, both in terms of the personnel and in terms of the challenges for the military, bearing in mind just how important there are still in your constituency representation by the Army and the Royal Navy, especially at Condor. So, Dave, thank you very much indeed for that insight. But let's move on to our next item this evening, because the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has sent a letter to UK diplomats issuing a directive requiring them to control and limit the access of Scottish government ministers in international engagements. The SNP has responded by accusing the UK government of being paranoid and insecure about Scotland having any presence on the world stage, and they've accused Mr Cleverly of attempting to shut down Scotland's international engagement. Responding to the letter, the SNP said the UK government crackdown showed it knows its deeply undemocratic stance towards Scotland is becoming an embarrassment to its reputation internationally. Commenting, the SNP Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Doogan MP, said, "This clumsy attempt to silence Scotland shows the UK government is paranoid and insecure about Scotland having a strong voice on the world stage. The Tory government knows its deeply undemocratic stance towards Scotland is becoming an embarrassment to its reputation internationally, which has already been shot to bits by Brexit and its repeated breaches of international law. This latest Tory attack on devolution shows weakness, not strength. It will backfire and strengthen support for independence. The only people who are not adhering to and respecting the devolution settlement are the UK government, who are riding roughshod over the powers of the democratically elected Scottish Parliament, left, right, and centre." So, Dave, firstly, Chris Law, your colleague Chris Law MP, said that there can often be some misunderstanding globally of Scotland's unique position as part of the United Kingdom. He was said that too many still can see Scotland as a breakaway secessionist state without recognising Scotland's legitimate and lawful campaign for independence. And personally, I would also add the comparatively short period of time that Scotland has been subject to the current union with England. So, do you think is in light of what Chris Law was saying, is what we're going to have here is James cleverly working to increase international misunderstanding?
I don't think it's as sophisticated as that, Andrew. I don't think James cleverly has, first of all, consistent with most UK government ministers, the first clue about the optics of any of these things in Scotland, how any of this stuff lands in Scotland. They continually, when they're trying to hold us and bring us to heel, talk about a union of equals. And then when Scotland tries to influence or exert any kind of control over any issue, however paltry, we're told that that's reserved and that's for the United Kingdom government, which in actual fact is increasingly becoming apparent to many people in Scotland as a euphemism for the English government. Because when the UK government acts in this way, in this unilateral, dogmatic, dictatorial fashion, at the cost, both material and political, of the people of Scotland and the Scottish government whom we've all elected, in whose interests are they acting? Many people in Scotland are now apt to wonder. They can't be acting in the interests of the people of Scotland because it's contrary to the ambitions of the democratically elected government of Scotland to do so. And if Scotland is 8% of the United Kingdom, then we're surely entitled to 8% of the capacity of the foreign and Commonwealth diplomatic missions around the world. Because the UK government isn't shy of saying how lucky we are in Scotland that the FCDO champions whisky around the world, as if whisky wasn't the ultimate product which pretty much sells itself. And they can't roll back from this stuff. They're worried. They're scared. They can see they've done their internal polling on the appetite for independence in Scotland, which they won't share, despite the fact that it was funded by public funds. So they know the way the people of Scotland are thinking. They know what it is to maintain a consistent and robust 50% in support of Scottish independence, and how little it will take to surge that up to 60%, far higher than they achieved with their Brexit enterprise. So my colleague Drew Hendry is absolutely right. This smacks from top to toe of insecurity and paranoia.
Thanks, Dave. And just to put it into a little wider context, I was just thinking, where do you think this fits into what might be seen as the wider approach of the Tory government in Westminster to the Scottish government, and you might say to the voters who elect the Scottish government? And I'm thinking, of course, about the Section 35 order, the Internal Markets Act, and the recent refusal of both Alistair Jack and Suella Braverman to come and give evidence to the committees at Holyrood regarding what they're doing.
Well, I mean, they are very much of the view that the Scottish government exists, unfortunately, they're not there to answer to the will of the Scottish Parliament or the ambitions of the Scottish people outside Westminster.
Thanks, Dave. That's some great context, and we will be looking at a bit more context later on in the programme. But let's move on to our next item now, because a damning new report has found that the Department for Work and Pensions, the DWP, their health assessment system has contributed to the deaths of claimants. The report, published by the House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee, comes 5 years on from its first inquiry, which at the time found significant problems. The committee has since concluded that many of these problems still remain and that important changes are required to improve trust and transparency within the system. Commenting, the SNP's social justice spokesperson David Linden MP said, 5 years ago the Tories were warned by this very committee that the DWP's health assessment system required urgent change. They didn't act, and now some claimants have paid the ultimate price. We have sadly become accustomed to this. The sanction regime introduced by this Tory government has plunged millions of families into poverty, forcing many to remain on universal credit and to take lower paid jobs. In contrast, he continued, under a progressive SNP government, people in Scotland enjoy a social security system that is built on fairness, dignity and respect, and provides a safety net for those on the lowest income. And all of this is achieved with one hand tied behind our back. So David Linden said this is a scandalous revelation which lies squarely with the Tories. So where do you think does this particular example of political ideology fit into the wider approach that you see in Westminster of a Tory government and their approach in particular towards people who at the moment claim benefits?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hugely depressing feature of what's happened to the Department for Work and Pensions and the way that people who are in need are supported, particularly disabled people. And every MP, no matter what colour of rosette they wear, will be familiar with really tragic cases of people who've not been supported properly, who've been through grueling assessments that don't take appropriate consideration of their level of disability, and they're not sufficiently supported financially to live a life with any degree of comfort or dignity. And that is a tremendous spiral that many people are plunged into, and it's testament to the resolve and the determination of many people and their families that oftentimes support them, that this figure isn't much higher. But of course, as the committee has warned, this number could be very much higher than the 69, I think, that they identified. And that should be a real wake-up call for the United Kingdom government. I think there's a well-worn saying, isn't there, Andrew, that you can judge the character of a country by the way that they look after the most vulnerable in that country, and by that measure, the United Kingdom is not to be judged particularly highly. And I think it's a great boost ahead of independence that we can further demonstrate the different values and the different way that we will resource benefits, which is almost now for a lot of people a dirty word, benefits. I deal with constituents who don't want to have a benefits audit because they don't want to accept benefit. There's absolutely nothing wrong with receiving from the pot that you've been paying into throughout your life. It's about collective security in a social context, and it's a shame that the Tories and the right-wing press have turned the word benefit into a sort of euphemism for idle, feckless behaviour. It couldn't be further from the truth. If people need help, they should get help, and it's a shame that dynamic has been so grotesquely corrupted by the Conservatives in the last 13 years that they've been in power, which they're apt to forget, of course. They're still in the habit of blaming governments that went before them for some of the challenges, but they heralded universal credit as the be-all and end-all, the answer to all the problems for the DWP, but actually what it is a Trojan horse to try and keep people in poverty and minimise the exposure to the exchequer of supporting people who are having challenges supporting themselves, which is a real challenge now because we've got working poor, which should be a contradiction in terms, but it isn't. And some of this is very, very upsetting for people that you do the right thing, you work hard, you go out to work, and even by the government's own measure, you still don't earn enough to support your family, and you're entitled then to tax credits. Why tax somebody just to give it back to them? It's just an absolute waste of administrative resource and comes at great cost, usually to the person who's paid the tax. So it's if you're on a low or no income situation in the United Kingdom just now, you're in a difficult spot, and no mistake.
Thanks, Dave. I think that quote was Tony Benn, but I'll check while we're talking this evening. I'll go and dig it up so we know for sure. But it's a very good point that you make. But let's move on now to a story that's even more closely associated with the North East, because the UK government has failed to respond to calls for it to provide funding to match the Scottish government's commitment to a £500 million Just Transition Fund. Following a 3-month wait for a reply to his letter, the SNP Energy and Industrial Strategy spokesperson Alan Brown MP accused the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, of failing to offer the money required to help ease the transition for families and business in the northeast of Scotland. Commenting, Alan Brown MP said, after 3 months of waiting, the Secretary of State's response has confirmed that the UK government is not interested in a just transition for the northeast. At a time when Harbour Energy has announced 350 redundancies, this response is nothing short of tone deaf. The SNP's commitment to a just transition is in stark contrast to the Tories, who have left people and businesses across the North East waiting almost 2 years for Westminster to match the SNP Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition Fund. So, Dave, firstly, thinking about the politics of this for a moment, and then we'll broaden it out. But first, the politics, do you think is this refusal to commit an indication, perhaps, that either those businesses who are asking for investment just haven't been supporting Tory MPs enough yet, or is it an acknowledgement of current polling, which suggests that David Doogan will lose his Banff and Buchan seat at the next general election in 2024. So the Tory pork barrel circus, which only invests where there's a sitting Tory MP, has definitely left town?
Well, so I think it's more complex than that. I think that's definitely a feature of it, because anybody who's remotely informed about the green transition credentials of the Acorn project in the northeast at St Fergus is the most ready to go project, directly linked into the subsea network and right next to a gas-fired power station. It is the best proposition for carbon capture, utilisation and storage, and yet that's the one that the UK government won't fund. Very curious behaviour for them. If they wanted a quick win, it will come with an Acorn project label on it in the northeast of Scotland. But they won't fund it. And it's very interesting as well that they won't fund it even though it's in the constituency of a Conservative MP. They're far more interested in shoring up their red wall gains in 2019. And the first tranche of investment in carbon capture, utilisation and storage has delivered precisely nothing in terms of carbon capture benefit, despite being awarded or allocated many millions of taxpayer pounds in the first round, and we're still no further forward. That wouldn't be the case if Scotland had been backed with our project in St Fergus. So there is, without question, politics involved in this. But actually, it gets to the heart of the climate sceptic fringe maybe fringe is too polite, core maybe within the Conservative Party. If they thought they could get away with it politically, they would absolutely thumb their nose at the climate emergency. It's not core Tory value to be decarbonising. They're right up there with the Sarah Palins of this world, and not remotely interested. They're also obsessed with nuclear. And they'll throw any amount of government subsidies at nuclear, but much less at renewables and carbon capture, utilisation and storage. So some of it's doctrine, some of it's pork barrel, some of it's electoral politics and party politics. But taken together, who's, as usual, on the receiving end of the cost of it? Scotland.
Thanks, Dave. And I think that quote is more properly attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. There's a wee bit of debate when I was just checking it there, but I think it was Mohandas K. Gandhi who gave us that quote. But we've been talking about the nature of conservative politics in the UK at the moment, and I'd like to continue that with our next item, because more senior Conservatives have hit out at Suella Braverman's racist rhetoric, accusing her of undermining the party for the sake of her own leadership ambitions. Pressure has been mounting on Rishi Sunak to intervene to protect the party's reputation after the Home Secretary stoked renewed anger by criticising police for confiscating a set of racist dolls displayed in an Essex pub. Tory MPs, peers and activists have accused Braverman of inflaming racial tensions on a number of occasions over the past few months, saying they are worried that she is now at the risk of repelling the kinds of swing voters the party is desperate to retain. A former senior minister from Boris Johnson's government is reported by The Guardian to have said that they believed that Braverman was a real racist bigot. The person said the country is not as grotesque as she makes it out to be, warning that the Conservative reputation on discrimination has dropped to a new low under her watch, which also gives the country a bad name. The criticism reflects widespread anger felt by many Tory MPs and peers about Braverman's frequent use of racially charged language. Earlier this month, the Home Secretary said grooming gangs were almost entirely made up of British Pakistani men, whom she said hold cultural attitudes completely incompatible with British values. Last November, there was an outcry after she said that the small boats crossing the Channel amounted to an invasion of immigrants. Now, Dave, Baroness Warsley, the former chair of the Tory party, told The Guardian earlier this week, the faces within our cabinet may have changed, but attitudes and the language being used are from a bygone era. Change, she said, it seems, is only skin deep. Do you think, is the former chair of the Tory party, Saira Warsley, is she right in what she's saying?
Absolutely. And, you know, I think whatever your politics are, if you look at the UK cabinet and the skin tones around that table, I think undoubtedly that has to be viewed as progress. But there's many people, myself included, and sometimes I have to sit quite close to the bile that comes out of Suella Braverman. And I sometimes, and other people, that if that was a white person saying that, it would blow up immediately as a racist scandal. And it has to be, if equality is to mean anything, then racist rhetoric is racist rhetoric, no matter who is saying it, no matter what colour they may be, or what their ethnic background might be. If you're being racist, if you're demonstrably using language that is heightening racial tension, which she is clearly, then it's a huge source of concern. But of course, one of the problems, Andrew, as well, is that she just simply isn't particularly bright. She was the Attorney General before she was the Home Secretary, and she was hopeless at that job as well. She's thoughtless on her feet, she's inarticulate, she's unnecessarily abrasive, and apt to bouts of unbridled aggression, which isn't particularly becoming of a Home Secretary who should have a cool head, a strategic mind, and a long view. And she lacks all of those qualities and is in ample possession of all of those negatives. And I think It's no surprise that many of our more considered and intellectual Conservative colleagues are presumably holding their head in their hands in private, listening to views getting spouted by a Home Secretary which are anathema to them, and I'm certain their constituents as well. She's, I mean, a lot of this is put down to her ambitions to be the next leader of the Conservatives once they lose, or if they lose, which I think, incidentally, is by no means a foregone conclusion that they'll lose the 24 general election. And if she is, I mean, I don't care. I couldn't honestly tell you how little I care about who runs the Tory party on the UK level. Not that invested in who runs it at a Scottish level. But if that's her motivation, then she's got a funny way of going about it. But this is a particular cadre of mentality that's come in, that's crept into the Tory party. And I'm not a fan of Tories in particular, one way, shape, or form. One hue's much the same to any other, of wherever they land on the political spectrum within the Tory party. But we see this thoughtless, crass, aggressive, vengeful language from her in terms of migration. It's exactly the same that we heard from Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister, and on the economy. It's ill-informed and inarticulate, unintelligent, and unreal. Actually, a lot of it's unreal. It's from the Trump playbook. It's manufacturing grievance in order to facilitate your other political ends. I think it's unsustainable, and she'll come unstuck. Sooner the better, really, in the interests of most ordinary people.
Thanks, Dave. When you were describing the talents that a Home Secretary requires, Willie Whitelaw suddenly popped up in my head. So I don't know where that came from, but thank you. That was some also your own experience from sitting in the House of Commons, listening to this current Home Secretary speak is useful insight as well. Thank you. But we'll move on now, because civil service unions in the UK have warned of a fresh wave of industrial action after the government announced that pay rises would be limited to 4.5 to 5%. In a move dismissed by their union leaders as insulting. The two sides have been involved in talks in recent weeks, but it is understood the increase was presented to them as non-negotiable. Those covered include the 100,000 plus members of the PCS who have taken part in a wave of strikes in recent months, as well as senior civil servants represented by the First Division Association Union. Official pay remit guidance published by the Cabinet Office today allows for average pay awards of 4.5% plus an additional 0.5% for the lowest pay bands. Civil service unions reacted with fury. The PCS General Secretary, Mark Serwotka, said this insulting proposal will serve only to anger PCS members, stiffen the resolve ahead of the forthcoming reballot, and increase the likelihood of a new wave of sustained strike action. The PCS is balloting to continue its industrial action, which has hit public services, from border checks to driving tests, while the FDA's executive is holding an emergency meeting on Wednesday to consider balloting for strikes. Now, Dave, Mark Serwotka also said, unlike the health and education unions that have had intensive talks leading to improved pay offers, we have been given no opportunity to negotiate. It's the most deplorable way to treat their own staff. Now, when I was reading that, I was struck. Should we, in fact, be surprised at Tory ministers treating their staff in a deplorable way? I'm thinking in particular of the numerous complaints about the behaviour towards civil servants like Priti Patel and Dominic Five Eyes Raab. The Five Eyes are said to stand for imperious, insular, idle, irascible, and ignorant, by the way.
So, I mean, I think there is definitely an issue between the Tory party and the civil service machine, which some of them publicly refer to as the blob. I think that is really unacceptable. The civil service is the gears and the oil of government. Without the civil service, I say this as somebody who was a civil servant for 18 years, without the civil servants, there is no government. You cannot run the business of government without a functioning bureaucracy. most of which, 99% of which, is made up of civil servants. So it's not acceptable. And people have put up with paltry or no pay rises at all for the majority of the last 15 years in the interest of whichever crisis the political establishment in Britain has created for them to have to deal with. So that was a banking crisis, and then a Brexit crisis, and then a Brexit response, which was amongst the poorest in the developed nations. That's not to say the cheapest, it's probably most expensive and the poorest amongst the developed nations in the world. So there's always a reason not to remunerate your civil servants properly. Certainly is with the Tories. And while Scotland remains shackled to the United Kingdom, we have to feed at the same meagre table as the rest of them. So it's hugely problematic and it's unsustainable. People's cost of living, people's standards of living have habitually fallen as prices have risen and wages have failed to keep up. And when I was in the civil service, Andrew, there was always an understanding that you were never going to get paid as much as you got paid in the private sector. And if you didn't like that, you could leave and go and join the private sector. There was no handcuffs involved. But you also had to understand that you got a better pension than you did in the private sector. You got more annual leave than you did in the private sector. And that was the quid pro quo. That was the agreement that was basically understood. You withstood lower pay for better terms and conditions. Now they've got much lower pay, and their terms and conditions have been seriously eroded as well. And lots of people are voting with their feet. And I don't have a lot to do with the civil service in London because I'm within the Parliament most of the time. But when I do meet civil servants, they're very, very young. They're very clever, very bright, but they're very young. And the problem is a lot of the older, more seasoned, experienced people who have been around the block, who have dealt with difficult ministers of all political persuasions, are voting with their feet. And when you end up with a very not juvenile, but certainly a very much younger cohort of senior civil servants, then you start to get very bad decisions, and they'll be much more apt to lean to bend to their political masters, which sometimes, as a civil servant, a senior civil servant, you have to stand up to your political masters when they're about to do something that's at the cost of the country. And people like Dominic Raab and Priti Patel, and I'm sure Suella Braverman, they don't like that.
That's a very good point, Dave. Thank you. Now then, I'm watching the clock, so we'll move on to our next item this evening, because Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Martin, has criticised remarks by the former Democratic Unionist Party leader Arlene Foster, who said Joe Biden hates the UK. Martin said that Foster was wrong, saying her remarks about the US president were misplaced, as Biden did not hate anyone. I'm very surprised by that comment, Martin told RTE's This Morning earlier today. The one word that you do not associate with Joe Biden is the word hate. He's the antithesis of that. He's the opposite of that. He always speaks about the dignity of every human person. He's more love than hate by a country mile. Biden has spoken about the importance of treating everyone with dignity in each of the 3 speeches he has given on his 4-day trip to Ireland. Foster doubled down on her remarks earlier this week, saying on Thursday that the president had disdain for the UK. Yesterday, President Biden urged the UK to work closer with Ireland on strengthening efforts to sustain peace in Northern Ireland. Before leaving Ireland today, the President will visit Knock at about lunchtime and pray at the nearby Basilica and Marian Shrine, an important Catholic pilgrimage site said to mark the apparition by Mary, the Mother of Jesus, in 1879. President Biden will then honour his son, Beau, who died of brain cancer in 2015, during a private visit to the Mayo Roscommon Hospice. The hospice had previously paid tribute to Beau Biden, a former Delaware Attorney General. In 2017, Joe Biden travelled to the Mayo town to turn the first sod on the site for the new hospice complex, and he again paid tribute to the €6.3 million palliative care centre when it opened 2 years ago. The US president then visited a genealogy and heritage centre established to help descendants of Irish people who emigrated to the US including his ancestors on his father's side, before giving a final keynote speech outside a cathedral in Ballina. Now, Dave, there's two things here. As I said, Arlene Foster doubled down on her remarks, saying on Thursday that the president had disdain for the UK. Now, I'm not disagreeing with Michael Martin here, but I wonder if she's onto something here. It struck me that every US president for at least the last century or more has had a degree of disdain for the UK. It goes with the job. In the UK, we're living here on Airstrip 1, quotation, and this place is now no more than an empty husk of a former colonial power that's failing to trade on its past military excesses as an economy sinks, and we're turning in on ourselves, turning away from Europe by the Brexiteers. So, in a sense, is she right when she says that the president has disdain for the UK, and we shouldn't be surprised?
No, I don't think she is right, and I'll tell you why. Is because one thing the United States understands is the economy and economics, and the UK is, for all its many internal faults and contradictions, the UK remains a very large global economy. And that's important to the United States because the United States makes a lot of money out of that economy. And the on the defence side of things, the United Kingdom, whilst the constant bleating, the pleading to have the special relationship acknowledged by the United States is literally toe curling. It's the most pathetic thing ever. And the current Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is very guilty of blabbing on about the special relationship. It is special in its embarrassment, but the United States would openly regard the United Kingdom as its closest military ally, which, given how much the United Kingdom spends on United States hardware, is hardly surprising. But no, it doesn't hold the United Kingdom in contempt. Arlene Foster is wrong, not for the first time. But it does hold the United Kingdom's decisions around Brexit and the political elite walking blindfolded into this UKIP trap of holding a referendum on Brexit. It holds that in despair. The United States despairs of the United Kingdom because from the outside they can see even clearer than we can from the inside what an absolute abject act of self-harm Brexit was, and how dreadfully it's affected our economies and communities in Scotland. And so they told the United Kingdom at the outset that if you come out of the European Union, you'll be at the back of the queue. That was the president's words, President Obama's words. You will be at the back of the queue for a trade deal. And so there doesn't sound very much special about that relationship. And the United States have remained true to their word. The UK does not have a trade deal with the United States. And they're so concerned about that, they make the repeal of the sanctions that was introduced by President Bush on whiskey and aircraft parts. They make the repeal of that sound like a great trade triumph. Basically, just resets things to where we were already. So, the US will never do anything to jeopardise the United Kingdom's opportunities to make the United States money. But at the same time, what they hold very dearly and clearly is Ireland, so close to them. And Scotland should be instructed by the platform that good relations with the United States brings you, no matter what your actual population or GDP size is. And of course, GDP in Ireland is far bigger than it is in the United Kingdom and far more evenly spread to boot. That is the model. Now, we don't have the Irish diaspora to anything like the same scale, or the Scottish diaspora, rather, anything like the same scale as the Irish diaspora in the United States. But nevertheless, Scotland as a brand has very few rivals globally, and that includes especially the United States. And so when we see the very dear relationship that Ireland enjoys with Washington and the United States more generally, that should be the blueprint that we pursue once we're independent of this disunited kingdom.
Thanks, Dave. You elegantly and perfectly anticipated another question I had for you with regard to the relationship between the US and Ireland, so I'm very grateful to you. So we'll move to our final item this evening because victims and witnesses are set to use virtual reality headsets to familiarise themselves with giving evidence in court as part of a pioneering Scottish Government initiative to allay fears or discomfort around the process. Ahead of giving evidence in court, the world leading £500,000 virtual court project will allow victims to walk through a three-dimensional world comprising actual videos of the court where their case will be held. The system uses cutting-edge software to allow victims and witnesses to interact in a virtual environment that includes depictions of the people and objects they can expect to encounter when they go to court. The project will enable victims and witnesses to be supported by Victim Support Scotland volunteers as they experience. This will remove the need to travel to court prior to their hearing while allowing people to familiarise themselves with what can be unfamiliar, daunting, and often re-traumatising environment. The project, a partnership between VSS, tech provider Immersonal, and CivTech, the world's first successful public sector focused innovation accelerator, has delivered a working prototype for Glasgow Sheriff Court and the High Court in Glasgow, with wider development and rollout over the next year. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, Angela Constant, said, "We continue to put victims at the heart of the criminal justice system. Their needs are an absolute priority. However, victims and witnesses can naturally find giving evidence a daunting prospect. This unique project, using innovative technology to support and prepare victims for attending court, could prove transformative." So, Dave, finally this evening, slightly broader question for you. In your conversation with voters and electors, are they recognising and are they valuing the child-centred approach to education, the claimant-centred approach to social security, and the victim-centred approach to the criminal justice system, which the Scottish Government is now pursuing? I'm sorry, Dave, can you hear me?
Well, yeah, I very much think they do. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, can you hear me?
Thanks. Yep,
You still there?
yep, carry on, Dave.
Yeah, so I think very much that the people in Scotland haven't had, um, yeah, very much with a 16 years of SNP government, which is founded on putting people at the centre of policy and legislation, has resulted in the very valuable principle of nothing about me without me. And that runs through from education to criminal justice to the welfare system to health, right across the suite of public sector interventions that we make in support of people in their lives. The days of doing things to people are gone, and you know, as well-meaning as that all was, and as good as it could be in terms of getting people at better outcomes, and that's fine. But far better to make sure that people are at the centre of whatever element of public sector intervention they find themselves subject to, that they're at the centre of it, that they feel empowered and in control of that which is happening to them, and that they're informed and have got capacity to deal positively with whatever is happening, whether that's an appointment at a allied health professional, or it's being given evidence in court. I think it's really important that we realise that these are services to be delivered, not authorities to be applied.
Thanks, Dave. That's some great perspective to finish the programme this evening, because I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach. Please help us to continue to make these programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can continue to pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, and you can find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. We will be back on Sunday at 12 noon for the next edition of the Full Scottish, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this, who is or will watch this programme, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest, Dave Doogan MP. Thanks, Dave.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks, Andrew.
If you'll indulge me for a moment this evening, in April 1736, 3 smugglers, William Hall, George Robertson and Andrew Wilson, had been tried and condemned to death. Wilson and Robertson waited their fate in the Tolbooth next to St Giles. A few days before their execution, they even tried to escape. Wilson removed a bar from a cell window, but became stuck because he was a very stout man. Then, on this day in April 1736, Wilson and Robertson were hanged in the Grassmarket. However, when the body of Wilson was cut down by a sailor, Captain Porteous of the City Guard reacted by grabbing a musket and firing at him. Porteous missed and killed a man standing in the crowd. Porteous then ordered the guards to fire on the enraged crowd, killing a further 5 people. In the ensuing riot, the hangman, Porteous, and the guards sought refuge in the guardhouse on the Royal Mile as the situation worsened. This prompted the Lord Provost to instruct Porteous to call out the entire guard, furnish them with powder and shot, and ensure the guardhouse was not stormed. Now, accounts of the events that followed are confusing, but what is certain is that Captain Porteous initially instructed his troops to fire above the heads of the crowd. However, in doing so, in the city centre, they simply wounded people standing in the windows of the surrounding tenements, which just made the crowd even more violent. As panic set in, Porteous ordered the city guard to shoot directly into the mob, which led to the deaths of another 6 people. Eventually, the rioters retreated and the streets quietened. Porteous was later found guilty of murder and was eventually himself hanged during another riot. I'm away to find out what other mayhem other Andrew Wilsons have been causing. I hope that you have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.